The summer heat of Texas pressed down on Camp Hearne like a heavy blanket, but inside the newly constructed mess hall, the air hung thick with something far more oppressive than humidity: disbelief. Wilhelm Hoffman stared at the metal tray before him, his hands trembling as if holding something sacred or forbidden. The beef stew contained actual chunks of meat larger than his weekly ration in the African campaign, vegetables that weren't rotting, white bread made from real wheat instead of sawdust, and beside it all sat a glass of milk so cold and pure it seemed to glow in the afternoon light. "This cannot be real," he would write to his mother 6 months later, when the letter finally reached Hamburg through the maze of wartime censorship. "They are showing us propaganda food. Tomorrow we will return to turnip water like everyone else." Around him, 1,850 German prisoners of war from Rommel's defeated Afrika Korps sat in equal bewilderment. Men who had survived on 200 grams of sawdust-filled bread and watery soup made from fodder beets, now confronted with portions that would have sustained an entire Wehrmacht squad for 3 days. The silence in the mess hall was profound. Some prisoners wept openly, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten what abundance looked like. Others sat frozen, unable to reconcile the feast before them with 3 years of Nazi propaganda about America's weakness and imminent collapse. The clatter of cutlery had ceased entirely, replaced by the sound of grown men struggling to comprehend what their eyes were seeing. These soldiers could not have understood that they were witnessing the agricultural and industrial might of a nation that produced more food than it could consume, even while feeding 12 million men under arms and shipping 17 million tons of food aid to its allies across the Atlantic. The transformation that would begin with this first meal would ultimately shatter every assumption they held about American weakness, German superiority, and the inevitable triumph of the Third Reich. To truly grasp the psychological earthquake that this abundance represented, one must first descend into the depths of deprivation from which these men had emerged. By 1943, the German ration system had deteriorated into a complex hierarchy of hunger that would have impressed Dante himself. German civilians, if fortunate, received 1,700 calories daily. Soldiers in the field were promised 3,600 calories but rarely received half that amount. In North Africa, where most of these prisoners had been captured, the situation had devolved into something approaching medieval famine. Feldwebel Vera Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division in Tunisia, had kept a meticulous diary that survived in his family's possession. His final entry before capture read like a document from the Dark Ages. May 11, 1943. Division meal today: 150 grams black bread, mostly sawdust. 15 grams margarine rancid. Soup made from 1 potato and desert weeds. The Italians have nothing left. We are eating our horses. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been reduced to skeletal shadows by the time of surrender. Rommel himself had complained bitterly to Berlin about the impossible supply situation. Ships carrying food were being sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines faster than they could be replaced. What little provisions managed to reach North Africa often arrived spoiled by the brutal heat. By early 1943, German soldiers were suffering from scurvy, beriberi, and protein deficiency diseases that Wehrmacht medical officers hadn't encountered since the Great War. Oberarzt Friedrich Bauer, a medical officer captured at Kasserine Pass, documented the systematic deterioration of his men with clinical precision. "The soldiers' gums bled constantly from scurvy," he wrote. "Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency affected 30% of our troops. Edema from protein starvation caused their legs to swell grotesquely. We had become an army of walking skeletons, more ghost than soldier." The surrender in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, brought 275,000 Axis soldiers into Allied captivity. Among them were the elite of the German military machine, veterans who had conquered France, driven the British back to El Alamein, and believed absolutely in German racial superiority and American decadence. These men were about to receive an education in reality that no university could have provided. The first shock wave struck immediately at the temporary collection points scattered across North Africa. American quartermasters began distributing C rations and K rations to the prisoners with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to abundance. These combat rations, which American soldiers complained about constantly, seemed like miraculous provisions to the Germans. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, captured with the 95th Light Division, wrote with the wonder of a man witnessing magic. The Americans gave us small boxes they called K-rations. Inside was more food than I had seen in 2 months, crackers that weren't moldy, a tin of meat that was actually meat, chocolate, sugar, even cigarettes. They apologized that this was all they had. Apologized. The journey to America aboard Liberty ships provided the second revelation in this ongoing education in American abundance. These vessels, churning out of American shipyards at a rate that German naval officers would have declared impossible, were returning from delivering supplies to Europe. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo in holds hastily converted for prisoner transport. Here, German soldiers encountered American abundance in its most casual, almost unconscious form. Gefreiter Hans Weber remembered with crystalline clarity, American sailors threw away more food after each meal than my entire company had eaten in a week. Whole loaves of white bread, barely touched, went into the garbage. Sailors complained about having chicken too often. One man crushed a chocolate bar under his boot because it had melted slightly in the heat. We fought each other like animals to dig through their garbage. Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia presented a scene in August 1943 that shattered the prisoners' understanding of wartime reality. As they disembarked, blinking in the harsh American sunlight, they witnessed dock workers, many of them women and African Americans whom Nazi ideology had declared incapable of skilled labor, unloading ships while eating sandwiches thick with meat and cheese. These workers drank Coca-Cola and discarded the bottles without thought, smoked cigarettes continuously, and stubbed them out half-finished as if tobacco were as common as air. At the processing station, each prisoner received a medical examination that included something unimaginable: vitamin supplements specifically designed to address their nutritional deficiencies. German medical officers, themselves prisoners, found themselves working alongside American doctors who treated malnutrition cases that resembled concentration camp victims more than enemy soldiers. Major William Patterson, a U.S. Army medical officer at Norfolk, reported with clinical detachment, "The Germans arrived in a state of severe malnutrition that shocked our medical staff. Average weight was 30 pounds below normal. We documented cases of scurvy, pellagra, and beriberi, diseases of starvation we had only read about in medical textbooks. We immediately implemented a graduated feeding program to prevent refeeding syndrome. The train journey to the interior camps provided a 3-day immersion course in American agricultural abundance that no German university could have offered. As the trains rolled through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, prisoners pressed against windows like children, watching endless orchards heavy with apples, fields of corn stretching beyond the horizon, and dairy farms populated by herds of cattle so fat they seemed almost obscene to men accustomed to seeing livestock slaughtered for lack of feed. Every small town revealed the same impossible truth: grocery stores with windows full of food, restaurants advertising daily specials as if scarcity were a foreign concept, ice cream parlors with lines of customers treating frozen desserts as routine pleasures rather than impossible luxuries. The American POW camp system would eventually hold 425,000 German prisoners, with 371,683 present at its peak in May 1945. These prisoners were distributed across 700 camps in 46 states, a logistical achievement that would have impressed Caesar's quartermasters. Texas alone hosted approximately 50,000 German POWs in multiple facilities, taking advantage of the state's climate, which the Geneva Convention specified should be similar to where prisoners were captured. Camp Hearne, one of the first camps to receive Afrika Korps prisoners, had been constructed in just 4 months and could accommodate 4,800 POWs. It featured amenities that exceeded what most German soldiers had known as civilians: electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, recreation halls, and most incredibly, mess halls that served 3 hot meals daily. The first full day's menu at Camp Hearne was preserved in camp records like a historical artifact. June 5, 1943. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream and sugar, and orange juice. Lunch offered vegetable soup, roast pork with gravy, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread and butter, apple pie and milk. Dinner provided fried chicken, rice, green beans, cornbread, fruit salad, and coffee. This single day's menu contained approximately 3,500 calories, more than German civilians received in 2 days. The meat alone exceeded the monthly meat ration for German civilians. Obergefreiter Hermann Richter, a former factory worker from the Ruhr, wrote with the desperate honesty of a man whose worldview was crumbling, "I ate until I was sick. Then I ate more. We all did. Some men hid bread in their bunks, certain this bounty would end tomorrow. The American guards laughed and told us there would be the same food tomorrow and the day after. We didn't believe them. The abundance of food in American POW camps accomplished what no propaganda campaign could have achieved. It systematically demolished Nazi ideology through the simple act of consumption. These soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that America was weak, divided, teetering on the edge of collapse. Yet here they sat, being fed better than Wehrmacht officers, while America simultaneously prosecuted a two-front war spanning the globe. The camp canteen became an unlikely window into American consumer culture, a classroom where German prisoners learned about capitalism through candy bars and cigarettes. With the 80 cents daily they earned from labor, prisoners could purchase items that had vanished from German stores years ago: chocolate bars, cigarettes, razor blades, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, and most incredibly, ice cream. The canteen at Camp Hearne sold 5,000 ice cream bars weekly to German prisoners who hadn't tasted ice cream since before the war began. Gefreiter Fritz Müller wrote to his wife with the bewildered tone of a man discovering magic, "Yesterday I bought ice cream." Ice cream. In Germany, even party officials cannot obtain ice cream, but here enemy prisoners purchase it for 5 cents. The Americans have so much cocoa they feed it to prisoners of war. The therapeutic feeding program for malnourished prisoners revealed yet another dimension of American medical abundance that defied German comprehension. Prisoners received vitamin injections, nutritional supplements, and specialized diets designed to address specific deficiency diseases. The camp hospitals contained more medical supplies than most German field hospitals had ever seen. Penicillin, that miracle drug Germany couldn't produce, was administered freely to treat prisoner infections. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, a captured Wehrmacht medical officer, documented this abundance with the precision of a man recording miracles. "They gave us vitamins in bottles, hundreds of pills distributed like candy. In Germany, we had no vitamins available for our own wounded soldiers. Here, enemy prisoners received better medical care than German civilians could dream of accessing." By October 1943, labor shortages led to POWs working on American farms and in food processing facilities, providing them with a comprehensive education in American agricultural and industrial food production that completed their ideological demolition. At a cotton gin outside Houston, prisoners witnessed mechanical harvesting that challenged their understanding of what was possible. A single picking machine accomplished the work of 50 men. The gin processed more cotton in a single day than German textile mills processed in a month. But it was the casual abundance that truly devastated them psychologically. Field workers, including African American laborers whom Nazi ideology had declared subhuman, consumed lunches that would have constituted feasts in Germany: thick sandwiches filled with beef or ham, whole apples, slices of pie, and thermoses of coffee enriched with real cream. They discarded half-eaten food without thought, treating abundance as their natural birthright. Unteroffizier Johann Kellner, working on a farm near Jackson, Mississippi, wrote with the stunned comprehension of a man whose racial theories were dissolving, "The workers eat meat every day, white bread, fresh fruit. One man threw away an entire apple because it had a small bruise. In Germany, people would kill for that apple." At a Del Monte processing plant in California, prisoners observed trainloads of peaches transformed into canned fruit using technology that simply didn't exist in Germany. The plant processed more fruit in a single day than Germany imported in an entire year. Workers drank orange juice like water. Damaged fruit that would have been treasured in wartime Germany was dumped by the ton, fed to pigs, or simply allowed to rot. Nothing shocked German POWs more profoundly than American meat consumption. In Germany, Civilians received 250 grams of meat weekly when it was available at all. German soldiers were theoretically entitled to 150 grams daily but rarely received it. In American POW camps, prisoners consumed meat 2 or 3 times daily, and the quality astounded them even more than the quantity. This wasn't horse meat or mysterious canned substances labeled as meat. These were recognizable cuts of beef, pork, and chicken. Camp Shelby in Mississippi, which housed 5,300 German POWs at its peak, consumed 14,000 pounds of meat weekly. The camp butcher shop cut steaks, ground hamburger, and prepared roasts with a casualness that seemed almost obscene to men who had watched their families slowly starve. Obergefreiter Paul Fisher wrote with the wonder of a man discovering a new planet. Today, for Sunday dinner, we received roast beef, a slab as thick as my thumb. The Americans complained it was tough. In Germany, this would be wedding feast meat. My children have never seen such meat. The prisoners working at Swift and Company's meat packing plant in Fort Worth witnessed the full scope of American meat production with the awe of primitives encountering advanced civilization. The plant processed 5,000 cattle daily. Workers took home packages of beef that would have cost a German laborer a month's wages. The waste was magnificent, wrote Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann. They discarded meat for having too much fat that would have been treasure in Germany. One plant produced more meat in a week than all of Bavaria sees in a year. German POWs had subsisted for years on preserved vegetables, sauerkraut, pickled beets, and dried legumes. Fresh fruit had become a memory, available only to party elite. In American camps, fresh produce arrived daily like clockwork. The psychological impact of fresh oranges at breakfast cannot be overstated. Oranges, tropical fruit available in June in Texas, served routinely to enemy prisoners. The camps received regular shipments of apples, peaches, pears, grapes, and even bananas, fruit that most Germans hadn't seen since before the war. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker wrote with the reverence of a man witnessing daily miracles. They gave us oranges at breakfast, not for special occasions, but every day if we wanted them. The vitamin C cured my bleeding gums within a week. We ate more fruit as prisoners than German children see in an entire year. The vegetable variety seemed infinite to men accustomed to turnips and cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, corn, beans, peas, carrots, potatoes, onions, squash, all fresh, not preserved or rotting. Camp Hearne maintained a 50-acre vegetable garden worked by prisoners who marveled at the productivity of American soil and farming methods that seemed almost magical in their efficiency. Working on farms throughout America, prisoners encountered agricultural abundance that challenged their fundamental understanding of what was possible. In California's Central Valley, where some POWs were transferred for agricultural work, they picked fruit in orchards that stretched for miles beyond the horizon. They watched in horror as perfectly edible fruit was discarded for minor blemishes or destroyed deliberately to maintain market prices, concepts that would have seemed insane in food-starved Germany. In Germany, chocolate had disappeared by 1941, replaced by ersatz chocolate manufactured from roasted acorns and beet sugar. Real chocolate had become rarer than gold, more valuable than currency. Sugar was rationed to 200 grams monthly for civilians when available. In American POW camps, chocolate and sweets were everyday items as routine as breathing. The Camp PX sold Hershey bars, Baby Ruth, Snickers, and Milky Way, brand names that would become legendary among returned POWs. The psychological impact of this casual availability of luxury foods shattered minds conditioned to expect scarcity. Obergefreiter Kurt Wagner wrote with disbelief, "I purchased 5 chocolate bars with 1 day's wages. In Germany, all the money in the world cannot buy 1 real chocolate bar. What kind of nation possesses such wealth that it allows enemies to purchase chocolate daily?" The camp kitchens baked desserts daily as if sugar were unlimited. Pies, cakes, cookies, puddings. Sugar flowed liberally into coffee, onto cereal, into desserts. The prisoners, many suffering from years of sugar deprivation, initially made themselves violently ill gorging on sweets their bodies had forgotten how to process. Milk, butter, cheese, cream, dairy products that had virtually disappeared from German diets appeared in overwhelming abundance in American POW camps. Fresh milk accompanied every meal. Butter was spread thickly on bread. Cheese sandwiches were routine. Ice cream was so common it ceased to amaze. The calcium and protein from dairy products rapidly improved prisoners' health in ways that seemed miraculous. In Germany, milk was reserved for small children and pregnant women when available. Butter was a black market commodity worth its weight in silver. Cheese existed only in memory. At Camp Hearne, the local dairy delivered 500 gallons of milk daily. Prisoners who hadn't tasted fresh milk in years consumed it like medicine. Unteroffizier Franz Weber wrote with the emotion of a man rediscovering childhood. I drank a full glass of cold milk today. Real milk, not powdered, not condensed. It tasted like peace, like childhood, like everything we had lost. German coffee by 1943 consisted of roasted barley, acorns, or chicory, bitter substitutes that bore no resemblance to actual coffee. In American POW camps, real coffee flowed like water. The psychological impact of unlimited coffee cannot be understated for a culture that had prized coffee as central to social life. The aroma of brewing coffee in the morning, casual refills at every meal, the ability to drink coffee with real cream and sugar. These small luxuries delivered devastating blows to Nazi propaganda. Feldwebel Friedrich Tillman wrote with growing despair, the Americans consume coffee all day long, real coffee from Brazil enriched with cream and sugar. In Germany, my mother stretches 50 grams of ersatz coffee for an entire week. Bread, the fundamental staple of German diet, became another lesson in American abundance. German bread by 1943 was a dark, heavy mixture of rye, potato flour, and sawdust, rationed to 2,000 grams weekly for manual laborers. It often arrived moldy and inedible. In American POW camps, fresh white bread appeared at every meal. The camp bakery at Camp Shelby produced 10,000 loaves weekly, soft white wheat bread that Germans associated with luxury and prosperity. Prisoners could consume as much bread as they desired. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt wrote with amazement, white bread soft as cake, fresh every day. We can take as many slices as we want. In Germany, people are murdered for stealing bread. As prisoners were permitted to write home, their letters became vehicles of devastating truth that German censors struggled desperately to suppress. How could they explain to families surviving on turnip soup that German prisoners were consuming meat 3 times daily? Many prisoners initially fabricated lies in their letters, unable to burden their starving families with unbearable truth. Others sent their entire earnings home to purchase food on the black market, knowing their monthly wages could buy what their families couldn't obtain with ration cards. Unteroffizier Karl Hoffmann's letter to his wife, intercepted by German censors, read, My beloved Greta, I am well fed here. Do not worry about me. The Americans possess more food than they know what to do with. I understand now why they fight with such determination. They are protecting paradise. What stunned German POWs beyond the abundance itself was American flexibility in accommodating individual dietary needs. Prisoners with medical conditions received specialized diets. Diabetics received sugar-free meals. Those suffering from ulcers were provided bland diets. This individualized care for enemy prisoners exceeded what German hospitals could provide for their own wounded soldiers. The Americans even attempted to provide culturally familiar foods, procuring rye flour for dark bread and sauerkraut to ease the transition. This respect for individual dietary needs contradicted everything Nazi collectivism represented. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, senior German medical officer at Camp Shelby, wrote with growing confusion, the Americans expend more effort accommodating the dietary needs of enemy prisoners than the Wehrmacht invests in feeding its own soldiers. As increasing numbers of prisoners worked on American farms, they received a comprehensive education in agricultural productivity that would reshape post-war Germany. They learned about crop rotation, chemical fertilizers, mechanized farming, and irrigation systems. They witnessed yields that German agriculture couldn't achieve even during peacetime. Working on a wheat farm in Kansas, Obergefreiter Hermann Weber discovered that a single American farmer with appropriate machinery could cultivate 640 acres, land that would require an entire German village to work effectively. The combine harvester could process 100 acres of wheat daily with mechanical efficiency that seemed supernatural. The American farmer I worked for produced more food than my entire district in Bavaria, Weber wrote. He accomplished it with machines, chemicals, and scientific methods we had never encountered. November 25, 1943, brought another psychological shock. Thanksgiving dinner. The prisoners possessed no cultural context for this American holiday, but they understood abundance when they witnessed it. The meal served at Camp Hearne that day included roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, rolls with butter, pumpkin pie, apple pie, coffee, and milk. Each prisoner received portions that would have sustained a German family for an entire week. The turkey alone exceeded monthly German meat rations. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote with dawning comprehension. The Americans celebrated a holiday by feeding enemy prisoners like nobility. If every American family was consuming the same meal simultaneously, America is not a country, but a paradise. Prisoners working in American canning factories witnessed food preservation on an industrial scale that Germany simply couldn't match. At the Campbell Soup Factory in Camden, New Jersey, they observed the plant producing 10 million cans of soup annually. The assembly lines operated continuously, filling containers with meat and vegetables that German factories couldn't obtain. The technology astounded them. Automated peeling machines, continuous cookers, vacuum sealers operating with precision that seemed almost alien. But more shocking than the technology was the quality control. Cans with slight dents were rejected automatically. The waste stream from imperfect products exceeded Germany's total food production. Unteroffizier Fritz Müller wrote with disbelief. They rejected entire pallets of canned goods for having labels printed slightly off-center. Perfect food discarded for cosmetic flaws that would have been ignored in starving Germany. Ice cream emerged as the ultimate symbol of American excess, the most psychologically devastating luxury. In Germany, ice cream had been a rare pre-war indulgence, impossible during wartime. In American POW camps, ice cream was routine, ordinary, expected. Camp Shelby operated an ice cream machine that produced 50 gallons daily during summer months. Prisoners could purchase ice cream bars, cones, and cups at the canteen as casually as breathing. The concept that enemies were consuming ice cream while German children had never tasted it proved emotionally devastating. Obergefreiter Hans Meyer wrote, I ate chocolate ice cream today. In Germany, this would be unimaginable even for the wealthy. Here, prisoners of war purchase it with pocket change earned from labor. The transformation in prisoner health through proper nutrition was documented meticulously by American medical officers with scientific precision. Within 3 months of arrival, the average prisoner gained 25 to 30 pounds of healthy weight. Scurvy disappeared completely. Night blindness resolved. Protein edema subsided. Major Robert Harrison, chief medical officer at Camp Shelby, reported, the Germans arrived resembling concentration camp victims, emaciated, diseased, mentally affected by prolonged starvation. 3 months of proper nutrition transformed them into healthy young men. The prisoners themselves could scarcely believe their physical transformation. Muscles returned where none had existed. Energy levels increased dramatically. The mental fog induced by malnutrition lifted completely. They examined themselves in mirrors and saw men they had been before the war consumed them. As their health improved and their bellies filled consistently, many prisoners experienced crushing guilt about their families suffering in Germany. How could they enjoy 3 substantial meals daily while their children slowly starved? The truth that American enemies fed them superior food to what Germany provided its own people was too psychologically painful to share with loved ones. Unteroffizier Paul Fischer's unsent letter, discovered after the war, revealed this anguish. My dearest wife, I cannot tell you the truth of my situation. I consume meat every day while you starve. I am safe and comfortable while you endure bombing. The Americans treat me with greater kindness than our own government shows you. Christmas 1943 delivered another psychological blow that shattered remaining illusions. American church groups, civic organizations, and the Red Cross sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs. Each package contained chocolates, cookies, canned goods, cigarettes, and toiletries. Local communities added homemade items, knitted scarves, hand-drawn cards, cookies baked by church ladies who had never met the recipients. The packages were distributed without regard to rank or political affiliation, demonstrating egalitarian generosity that contradicted Nazi racial theory. This charitable behavior from enemies whose families were fighting and dying in Europe shattered the last remnants of Nazi ideology. Feldwebel Werner Kellner wrote, "American civilians whose sons we were attempting to kill mere months ago send us Christmas gifts. Churches prayed for our welfare. Children sent cards wishing us Merry Christmas. Only those absolutely certain of victory demonstrate such charity toward enemies." By early 1944, the food in American POW camps had evolved into an inadvertent education system more effective than any university. Prisoners learned about nutrition, vitamins, balanced diets, and food safety through daily experience. They discovered that adequate nutrition improved not just physical health, but productivity, mood, and mental clarity in ways they had never imagined. The camp libraries stocked American agricultural journals and cookbooks like textbooks. Prisoners studied American farming methods, food processing techniques, and nutritional science with the dedication of graduate students. They learned that American agricultural abundance wasn't accidental but resulted from scientific farming mechanization and efficient distribution systems that Germany had never developed. Obergefreiter Friedrich Becker, a former agricultural student, wrote with growing understanding, "The Americans have transformed farming into applied science. They test soil composition, breed superior crop varieties, and use chemistry to increase yields dramatically. No wonder they possess such abundant food supplies." As 1944 progressed and increasingly dire news reached the camps from Germany, the contrast between POW abundance and German starvation became psychologically unbearable. Letters that slipped past censors described cities reduced to rubble, civilians consuming grass soup, children dying of malnutrition while their fathers sat in heated American mess halls complaining about repetitive menus. The moral foundation of Nazism crumbled completely in the face of American abundance. How could the supposed master race be starving while their racially inferior enemies wasted food casually? The African American workers who emptied garbage consumed superior food to German officers. The ideology was dead, killed by daily experience of reality that contradicted every Nazi principle. The summer of 1944 brought fresh revelations as prisoners worked during America's peak agricultural season. They picked peaches in Georgia, harvested vegetables in New Jersey, and labored in Kansas wheat fields. The sheer volume of food production overwhelmed comprehension. In a single day at a Georgia peach orchard, prisoners picked fruit that would have supplied a German city for an entire month. Perfect peaches were sorted by size and quality. Slightly imperfect fruit was sent to canneries. Damaged fruit was discarded or fed to pigs without thought. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote with growing despair, "We fed peaches to pigs today, thousands of peaches too ripe for shipping given to swine." In Germany, people would weep for such fruit. An incident at Camp Shelby in July 1944 captured the psychological impact of American abundance with devastating clarity. Local farmers donated truckloads of watermelons for a 4th of July celebration. The German POWs had never encountered watermelons. This exotic fruit simply didn't exist in German experience. The prisoners received whole watermelons to share. Many didn't understand how to consume them. Some prisoners wept openly at the sweetness, at the abundance of pure sugar and water contained in fruit form. Unteroffizier Carl Schmidt wrote, "They gave us giant green fruits filled with sweet red flesh. Each one could feed an entire family. The Americans ate the centers and discarded the rest as if abundance were their natural condition." Working in Iowa cornfields provided another agricultural shock that redefined possibility. Iowa alone produced more corn than all of Germany produced of all grains combined. But most devastating to German comprehension, the majority was fed to animals, not humans. The concept of growing food specifically to feed to animals to produce meat represented a level of agricultural abundance that seemed impossible to men from a nation that couldn't afford to feed people adequately. Feldwebel Hermann Fischer wrote with dawning understanding. The farmer explained that corn was primarily for pigs and cattle. They cultivate food specifically to feed to animals to manufacture meat. The Americans possess so much grain they can afford to convert it to protein. At a sugar beet processing plant in Colorado, German POWs witnessed sugar production that defied all previous understanding of scarcity. Germany suffered severe sugar shortages, with civilians receiving 200 grams monthly when fortunate. The Colorado plant processed 5,000 tons of sugar beets daily, producing mountains of white sugar that seemed almost obscene in their abundance. Workers received 5-pound bags of sugar as partial payment for their labor. They used sugar liberally in coffee, on cereal, in baking, treating it like a common commodity rather than precious treasure. Obergefreiter Paul Weber wrote, "I watched a worker pour half a cup of sugar into his coffee. This represented 2 months of German sugar rations dissolved into 1 cup of coffee." German POWs working at Gulf Coast ports witnessed American fishing fleets bringing in catches that dwarfed German fishing industry output completely. Shrimp boats dumped tons of bycatch, perfectly edible fish discarded because they weren't the target species. At Galveston, prisoners watched shrimpers discard more fish in a single day than German fishing fleets caught in an entire week. The concept of throwing away food because it wasn't the preferred variety was psychologically incomprehensible. Gefreiter Hans Müller wrote, "They threw tons of fish back into the sea because they were the wrong species." In Germany, people would fight over fish heads. At Wisconsin dairy farms, German POWs encountered milk production that seemed to violate natural law. Individual farms produced more milk daily than entire German districts. The technology, mechanical milkers, refrigerated tanks, pasteurization equipment, was decades ahead of German farming capabilities. Most shocking was the casual waste. Milk that wasn't perfectly fresh was dumped without hesitation. Cream was separated and used liberally. Butter was churned in quantities that would have supplied German cities. Unteroffizier Fritz Wagner wrote, "The farm where I work produces 1,000 gallons of milk daily, one farm. They pour excess milk on fields as fertilizer, while German children have never tasted fresh milk." At an egg farm in Maryland, prisoners encountered industrial egg production, unknown in German agriculture. The farm housed 50,000 chickens, producing 40,000 eggs daily through automated systems that collected, washed, and sorted eggs with mechanical efficiency. Germans received 1 egg weekly on ration cards when available. American prisoners of war consumed eggs daily at breakfast as routine as sunrise. The Maryland farm shipped entire trainloads of eggs to cities throughout the region. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker wrote, "Each chicken house contained more birds than our entire village possessed. They discarded more cracked eggs daily than Germany produces monthly. Thanksgiving 1944 proved even more abundant than the previous year, despite America fighting simultaneously on 2 global fronts. The meals served to German POWs hadn't diminished, but had actually improved. Turkey, ham, roast beef, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, stuffing, gravy, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, 3 varieties of pie, ice cream, coffee, milk, and wine." The prisoners sat in stunned silence, contemplating a feast that exceeded pre-war German celebrations while their homeland starved and burned. Feldwebel Werner Müller wrote, "The Americans possess so much food they can feed enemies superior meals to what we provided ourselves during peacetime. They conquered us with food before their armies ever arrived in Europe." By late 1944, many prisoners stopped writing home about food entirely. The guilt had become unbearable. Hidden diaries and unsent letters discovered after the war revealed the psychological torture of abundance amid family starvation. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt's unsent letter read, "I dreamed I could send you a single American meal. The meat from my lunch could sustain you for an entire week. I exist in paradise while you endure hell." As 1945 began and reports of German collapse reached the camps, the contrast became surreal beyond comprehension. Prisoners learned of the Ardennes offensive failure while consuming New Year's dinner. They heard about German cities without food, heat, or water while sitting in heated mess halls. American newspapers displayed photographs of starving German civilians, children with rickets and swollen starvation bellies. The prisoners recognized their own families in these images. Obergefreiter Hans Fischer wrote, "The newspaper shows German children consuming soup made from grass. I had bacon for breakfast. My little Klaus is eating grass while I feast on meat." When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, German POWs in American camps confronted a terrible irony. The war's end meant they would eventually return to a destroyed, starving nation. Many genuinely didn't want to leave. The camps had become refuges from the starvation awaiting them at home. The United States military began implementing programs to train POWs in food production and preservation techniques they could use to help rebuild Germany. Prisoners learned canning, advanced farming methods, nutrition, and food distribution systems. Major General Louis Lurch, overseeing POW operations, stated, "These men have witnessed American abundance firsthand. They know prosperity is achievable. They'll return to Germany with knowledge that can help prevent mass starvation." As repatriation approached in late 1945 and early 1946, German POWs faced a cruel irony that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. They had to prepare to leave abundance for starvation, to exchange plenty for poverty, to abandon paradise for purgatory. The camp commanders instituted programs to gradually reduce rations, helping prisoners readjust to scarcity before their return to devastated Germany. Prisoners were taught to forage for edible plants, to create soup from minimal ingredients, to preserve food without refrigeration, survival skills that would have seemed primitive months earlier. The same camps that had demonstrated the heights of abundance now provided education in the depths of scarcity. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the senior German medical officer, wrote with clinical despair, "We must teach our men to starve again. Their stomachs have expanded with proper nutrition. Returning to German rations may kill some of them." Before repatriation began, each camp held farewell dinners that represented both celebration and mourning. The Americans provided final feasts that exceeded even holiday meals in their extravagance. At Camp Shelby's farewell dinner in February 1946, the menu included shrimp cocktail, prime rib, lobster tail, baked potato with butter and sour cream, asparagus, Caesar salad, chocolate cake, ice cream, wine, and coffee. Men wept openly, not from joy at returning home, but from terrible knowledge that they might never eat like this again. Venerable Friedrich Müller wrote, "Our last American meal was finer than any German feast I remember from before the war. Tomorrow we return to turnip soup and sawdust bread. America sends us home with full bellies and broken hearts." The journey home revealed the full scope of Germany's destruction with devastating clarity. As trains crossed into German territory, POWs pressed against windows, watching a moonscape of ruins where cities had once stood. Civilians at stations were skeletal figures, begging for food the returning prisoners didn't possess. At Frankfurt Station, returning POWs watched German civilians fighting over garbage from Allied military trains with desperate savagery. Children with swollen starvation bellies begged for chocolate that no longer existed in Germany. Unteroffizier Paul Weber wrote, "We returned to hell itself. My wife thought I was an imposter. I was too healthy, too well fed to be her husband. My son, born while I was imprisoned, has rickets from malnutrition. The shame is unbearable." Despite the trauma of return to devastation, former POWs became crucial catalysts for German recovery. They brought knowledge of American agricultural methods, food preservation techniques, and nutritional science. They understood that abundance was achievable because they had lived it, breathed it, consumed it daily. Many former POWs became leaders in German agricultural reform, introducing mechanization, chemical fertilizers, and scientific farming methods learned in American fields. Hans Müller, former Obergefreiter, became an agricultural advisor in Bavaria. He wrote, "We learned in American fields what German schools never taught, that science and democracy create abundance, while ideology creates only hunger." When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, former POWs understood its significance better than most Germans. They had experienced American generosity and abundance personally. They knew America could afford to rebuild Europe because they had witnessed the casual waste that demonstrated unlimited resources. The food aid that began flowing to Germany seemed familiar to former POWs. The same abundance they had experienced in captivity now extended to the entire German nation. Wilhelm Schmidt, former Feldwebel, wrote, "The Americans feed us again, this time as free men. They send wheat, milk powder, canned goods, the same food we ate as prisoners. Only now we understand it represents not conquest but compassion." Studies conducted in the 1950s discovered that former POWs who had been held in American camps showed significantly different attitudes than those captured by other powers. They were more likely to support democratic institutions, believe in economic cooperation, and maintain positive views of America throughout the Cold War. The food experience had been genuinely transformative, creating a generation of Germans who had literally tasted democracy and found it nourishing. These men had experienced abundance and wanted it for Germany. They had learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from production, not from racial superiority, but from agricultural science and democratic institutions. Dr. Hans Richter, studying former POWs in 1955, concluded, "The American camps were inadvertent schools of democracy. Through full stomachs, prisoners learned what their ideology had hidden, that democracy and capitalism could create abundance that fascism only promised." In the 1960s and 1970s, as former POWs aged and began recording their experiences for posterity, their testimonies consistently emphasized food as the most psychologically transformative aspect of captivity. The abundance had been more devastating to Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Werner Hoffmann, former Feldwebel, testified, "The Americans defeated us with food before their armies ever arrived in Europe. Every meal was a lesson in their power. We surrendered to abundance long before we surrendered to Eisenhower." Kurt Mueller, former Unteroffizier, wrote, "I learned more about America from its food than from its books. The casual waste taught me about surplus. The variety taught me about choice. The quality taught me about prosperity." In the 1980s, former German POWs began returning to America for reunions, visiting the camps where they had been held, now converted to other uses. They met with former guards and local civilians who remembered them with warmth and curiosity. At a 1985 reunion at Camp Shelby, former POW Hans Weber brought German beer to share with American veterans in a gesture of reconciliation. He offered a toast. "You fed us when we were enemies. You showed us abundance when we knew only scarcity. We returned to Germany with full bellies and new dreams for what our nation could become." American Guard veteran Robert Johnson responded, "We just fed you what we ate ourselves." Nothing special. That's what America is. Nothing special that seems miraculous to those who've known want. The numbers alone tell the story of American agricultural might versus German scarcity with stark mathematical precision. German civilian rations from 1943 to 1945. Bread 2,000 grams weekly. Meat 250 grams weekly when available. Fats 100 grams weekly. Sugar 200 grams monthly. Milk none for adults. Eggs 1 weekly if available. Daily calories 1,200 to 1,700. German POW rations in American camps. Bread unlimited. Meat 350 grams daily. Fats and butter daily. Sugar unlimited in coffee and desserts. Milk 1 quart daily. Eggs daily at breakfast. Daily calories 3,500 to 4,000. The contrast was not merely quantitative but qualitative. German rations consisted of ersatz substitutes, spoiled supplies, and sawdust fillers. American rations were fresh, varied, and of higher quality than German pre-war standards. This abundance represented not just superior logistics, but an entirely different understanding of what constituted adequate nutrition and human dignity. Post-war psychological studies found that German POWs in American camps experienced what researchers termed cognitive reconstruction through consumption. The daily experience of abundance forced them to revise fundamental beliefs about American society, German superiority, and the nature of national strength. Dr. Friedrich Braun's 1950 study concluded, the POWs underwent involuntary ideological conversion through ingestion. Every meal contradicted Nazi propaganda. The men were not brainwashed but belly-washed, converted through consumption rather than coercion. The transformation proved particularly profound because it was experiential rather than theoretical. The POWs didn't read about American abundance, they ate it. They didn't hear lectures about agricultural might, they harvested it. They didn't study democratic prosperity, they digested it. Former POWs introduced American food culture to post-war Germany with evangelical fervor. They brought recipes learned from mess halls, cooking techniques acquired from farm wives, and most importantly, the expectation that abundance was achievable through proper organization and democratic governance. The first German supermarkets in the 1950s were modeled on American stores described by former POWs with reverent precision. The concept of food choice, of aisles stocked with variety, of refrigerated sections in frozen foods, were all imports from the American captivity experience. Even American fast food's eventual success in Germany was partly prepared by former POWs who remembered hamburgers, hot dogs, and ice cream from captivity with nostalgic longing. They had tasted casual abundance and wanted it for their children and grandchildren. At the last major reunion of German POWs in 1995, marking the 50th anniversary of the war's end, 89-year-old Otto Müller delivered the keynote address to an audience that included American veterans, German veterans, and their families. We came to America as warriors of the supposed master race, convinced of our superiority, certain of victory. We left as chastened men who had eaten from democracy's table. The Americans fed us not from cruelty, showing us what we couldn't have, but from generosity, sharing what they possessed in abundance. Every meal was a lesson in humility. Every full belly was an education in possibility. We learned that America's strength lay not in its armies, but in its agriculture, not in its weapons, but in its wheat, not in its ideology, but in its ice cream. Yes, ice cream, that impossible luxury that American prisoners ate daily while German children starved. We returned to Germany with knowledge more valuable than military secrets. We knew abundance was possible because we had consumed it. We knew democracy worked because we had digested its fruits. We knew peace was preferable to war because we had tasted both. To the Americans who fed us, you conquered us with kindness. You defeated us with donuts. You converted us with coffee and cream. We who arrived as your enemies left as ambassadors of your abundance. The food you shared when we were prisoners became the foundation of our friendship as allies. Thank you for feeding us when we were hungry, for showing us mercy when we deserved judgment, for teaching us that strength lies not in taking but in giving. We ate democracy, and it transformed us completely. The audience, American veterans, German veterans, their families, rose in sustained ovation, united by the memory of when enemies became friends over food, when hatred dissolved in hospitality, when war ended not with vengeance but with vitamins and vegetables. The story of German POWs and American food abundance stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of unintentional psychological warfare. Without planning or propaganda, America conquered its enemies through the simple revolutionary act of feeding them well. The 425,000 German POWs who passed through American camps experienced a collective transformation through consumption that would reshape not only their own lives, but the entire trajectory of German-American relations. They arrived as Nazi warriors and left as witnesses to democratic abundance. They came believing in German superiority and departed knowing American prosperity. They entered as enemies and exited as future allies. The food served in American POW camps accomplished more than sustaining life. It changed minds, hearts, and ultimately, history itself. Every generous portion undermined Nazi ideology with devastating effectiveness. Every dessert demolished propaganda more thoroughly than bombs. Every glass of milk murdered the myth of American weakness more completely than military victory. The prisoners were defeated not by deprivation but by abundance, not by cruelty but by kindness, not by hatred but by hamburgers. In the end, America's greatest weapon proved to be not the atomic bomb, but the apple pie, not the Sherman tank, but the chocolate bar, not the B-17 bomber, but the beefsteak. The German POWs were conquered by consumption, defeated by dessert, vanquished by vegetables. They had expected to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an agricultural colossus that could feed its enemies better than Germany could nourish its own people. They witnessed the arsenal of democracy, but more importantly, they tasted the abundance of democracy. The transformation was complete and permanent. These men returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as converts to prosperity, advocates for abundance, missionaries of possibility. They had seen the future, and it was delicious. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in mess halls, not through destruction, but through generosity, not by breaking bodies, but by filling bellies. The German POWs who couldn't believe they were eating meat, fruit, and chocolate in American camps learned that democracy's greatest strength was not its ability to destroy, but its capacity to create, not its power to punish, but its ability to provide. They arrived hungry and left full, not just of food, but of new possibilities for what their nation could become. In their transformation lay the seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the peaceful, prosperous Germany that would emerge from the rubble of the Third Reich. The men who had marched for Hitler returned home as apostles of agriculture, prophets of prosperity, and witnesses to the power of a society that could turn enemies into friends through the simple revolutionary act of sharing its abundance. They had tasted America, and they would never be the same.